Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the issuing of the Perspective Online Decolonization of Law student journal. Right? This journal was constructed as an idea, I think last year or 2 years ago. And basically the idea behind it was to have a way of building a habit of disciplined writing amongst student activists. As you know, when the Fismas for protest took place, I believe that students put on the table a superior argument to the sector that it is still trying to even comprehend till this day. However, many of those arguments were labeled as being informal, being spoken underground and constructed in protest environments. So we thought, okay, let us create a platform that will develop the habit of writing, to develop these pieces of knowledge that students produce in their circles and build them up into something that will be tangible and valid in the academy as time goes by. So the students who have written here, if they do wish to develop their articles into becoming journal articles or even theses or dissertations, the space is available at Crescent for them to do so. So the first one was published in March this year, which focused on the Must Fall movement. Very disruptive articles were written there by young people. And now we said for the second semester, we're going to go into faculties. So we're going to tackle the law faculty first, looking at the discipline, its philosophy, and everything else that underpins what we think is the idea of law. So in there are articles written by 5 students, and we have selected 3 of them for part of the panel to talk about their articles. And then after that, we'll have an engagement with you. But I have a program in front of me. If you haven't received a copy of the journal, please raise up your hand so that I can distribute it in the venue. If you can take one and pass. Oh, sorry. For those who haven't received a copy, please try to take one copy so that others can have as well, and the program. Okay, so to introduce myself, for those who don't know, my name is Pedro Zeleni. I'm the editor of this journal, and I'm also the program director for this event tonight. I won't waste any time. I think we should hit the ball running. I would like to call to the front the Dean of the Faculty of Law to come and give his input. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Lebogang, Alan, Bernard, Savo, everybody else in the room. Pedro, thank you very, very much for the invitation. I want to start off by congratulating Crescent and the chair, Professor Keert, for spearheading this initiative. I think it's an important initiative, and I'm looking forward to reading the critical contributions that have been received from students relating to the decolonization of law. And that's an interesting starting point, of course, because frequently during the 2016 Fees Must Fall protests, the issue of decolonization of the curriculum intersected with the idea of the decolonization of law itself. So one of the challenges that I'm going to talk about very briefly this evening when it came to attending to the Faculty of Law's flagship LLB curriculum was how to achieve a decolonized legal curriculum when arguably the legal framework itself, the entire legal system, was not decolonized. So how do you teach students in a decolonized fashion law which itself is arguably still requiring a process of decolonization? So I really want to do a couple of things this evening. I want to thank not only Andre but also Alan and Canrad for the collaborative way in which initiatives like this have been handled historically at the institution, both in terms of public platforms for the sharing of ideas, but now quite excitingly in terms of tangible written material that is developing, and that I think very much is in line with the ethos of the institution, which is it's a representation of transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity in approaches. The legal framework is not exclusively the domain of the Faculty of Law. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, we cannot claim that. That is an underpinning set of grundnorms that need to apply across the institution. And I think it's through innovations such as this that we see how this is playing out in reality. I want to talk very, very briefly about the process that the Faculty of Law underwent over the past few years and is undergoing relating to the notion of decolonization of the curriculum specifically, and then perhaps more pertinently want to talk a little bit about the road ahead. Most of you know the story of 2016, 2017, the Fees Must Fall movement, and the benefit for the Faculty of Law was that it coincided with the national review by the Council on Higher Education of the LLB program across all public institutions in the country. So the benefit was that we could integrate ideas that were coming from our students from the ground, develop a process that involved students, and systematically attend to re-looking at our own curriculum, bearing in mind the caveat that I mentioned earlier on, that the legal system itself arguably hasn't gone through the same detailed interrogation. And the benefit of that process was that we were able to co-develop with students a new LLB curriculum, the first of its kind in the country, which will be rolled out from 2020. So next year's first years will be attempting a very different first year from the one which has historically been the first year LLB curriculum in this institution. And that is a product not just of what the law deans or the law professors think, but very much in this institution, a co-created product involving student leadership, broadly constructed, not just the leaders themselves, but also individual students, and I see some of them in the room, who've been part and parcel of co-creating with the Faculty of Law a new curriculum. And what has that meant? And perhaps that's interesting, because people would still ask, well, and in fact, this was the approach at a number of institutions. So, and this is a story that I suppose at some point needs to be written up, not in the sense of patting ourselves on the back that we've come through it in a particular way, but in terms of learning the lessons across the sector. Because what some institutions did and what some faculties did, and they paid the price for this, was to get stuck at debating the notion of, well, if you tell us how to decolonize the curriculum, then we'll do it. And those were the institutions that were not accredited initially. In fact, those were the institutions that were warned that you might just lose your LLB while you work out what it is that needs to be decolonized. The approach of the Faculty of Law and its students was to link the decolonization with the notion of relevance. The idea that modern day students, predominantly African students, studying law in this country, wish to study a law degree that is relevant for dealing with the problems that are emanating in our society. And that approach then immediately brings into play all sorts of notions, the notions that we talk about frequently, social justice, democracy, Ubuntu, through a legal lens. So the entire notion of transformative constitutionalism is the one that was, if we look from a legal philosophical point of view, and Carl Clare, who's at Northeastern University in the United States, is the person credited with really developing that notion for the South African context, and has written widely in that regard. So through this process, we rejigged the curriculum in such a fashion that we made it relevant, and we Africanized it by doing a few key things. So one of the weaknesses identified by the CHE, because there were weaknesses in all the curriculum of all the law faculties in the country, not enough exposure to writing, not enough in space in the curriculum for critical thinking and research. So what you find in the new curriculum is some modules like customary law that were typically a semester in duration, now being spread over a longer period of time, less focus on 2 tests and an exam, and more focus on giving students the opportunity to write. So that couldn't be achieved without changing the curriculum fundamentally. You can't carry on a 5-month basis and expect to have different outcomes. So in a number of instances, modules, interpretation of statutes, for example, is now going to be spread out over a year, with the idea being that instead of an examination in June and an examination in November, the June, July, August assessment piece will be a written piece. And that then very, very directly is an example of how to address the weaknesses that were existing in the system in terms of student writing, research skills, and the like. And that's just but one example. African regional law, for example, in terms of locating South African legal system against the backdrop of SADC and the African continent and the realities of issues of migration, trade, cross borders. Those issues are now going to be captured in a compulsory final year module called African Regional Law. It's presently an elective that was introduced and will now become a final year module. So some of the changes in respect of the new curriculum are or may be perceived to be cosmetic, or well, just add in a module on African Regional Law and then you say you've decolonized the curriculum. Not at all. Very much the detail will be in terms of now drilling down in terms of each module being pitched in each year now of the new curriculum, starting with the first year next year, where introduction to law is now completely rejigged in order to have a strong transformative constitutional underpinning. And the real assessment of whether this lands will be in the module content and the manner of presentation in which this occurs. And of course, we know that can only land if you've got the right people teaching those subjects, people who buy into this type of ethos and vision. And so therefore, the appointments process, the transformation of personnel within the faculty is very much part of the transformation journey of the faculty. So I can talk a lot about the accreditation process and the new LLB curriculum. Perhaps let me leave it by saying that there are fundamental changes relating to language, relating to forms of assessment in order to include more opportunities to write, so many more assignments in order to address the pre-existing weaknesses in the system, and then specific interventions like changes to customary law, African regional law, which are deliberate, direct attempts to transform the curriculum and to decolonize it. Where I think we're going, linked to curriculum specifically, and these are lessons that we're drawing from best practices in other parts of the world, is that although we've got legal practice, which is a very strong clinical law, 24 credit module in the final year, which is every 2 weeks students going to the law clinic and alternating that with street law programs and participation in mobile law clinics, so a strong link with our engagement arm. Where we're going, I think, is to develop more opportunities on an elective basis in the final years for students to really go deep in terms of experiential learning, which we believe is going to help bridge the challenges that the profession experiences in terms of the level of practicality with law curricula generally, but more importantly, could give our students the edge in terms of obtaining employment, which is ultimately what the major mission of the law faculty is. I think everything that is done, from branding to marketing to reformulating our space, our curriculum, ultimately the end game, what is it? It's about delivering a product of law student that is going to, or law graduate rather, that is going to be able to hit the ground running, that is going to be able to excel in the real world out there. So where I see part of the future is in terms of more elective opportunities, so that students who have a practical orientation are able to do 4 electives on top of the legal practice module, where they are actually working with NGOs, with governmental departments. Of course, they have to be the right partners, and gaining experience on the ground while this all being based on a solid theoretical underpinning. Perhaps 2 final points about where I think the academic project of the faculty is heading, and then I'll stop. The one relates to a creation of an academic support hub, which is, I think, one of the major projects for next year, because we understand that students don't have the right type of support in terms of blended learning, Moodle, online, use of technology, as well as writing support, and then academic mentorship and peer support. So what we're doing is creating an academic support hub, which will include trained personnel who are able to assist our undergraduate students in those 3 areas: academic advising, technological support, and then specifically writing support, which again resonates so well with what we're doing this evening, which is celebrating the launch of an online journal containing student writing. And then finally, the intersection with the profession, which I alluded to in terms of a new set of electives, which I foresee developing in the future. And one of them, by the way, in fact, all of them ultimately will also link back to transforming and decolonizing the curriculum. For example, the one that's planned for next year is a specific elective in mediation. Now, if you go back to original notions of justice and an approach to resolving disputes that is non-litigious, that is based on peaceful settlement of disputes in the African culture, for example, we're going to find that that is going to come into the curriculum directly. But the end point in terms of linking the curriculum to the profession is very much involving and integrating the profession into our space. So part of what we are building and reserving in our new building, which will hopefully be up, I want to look in the front row and say hopefully by next year, but don't hold me to that, is space for visiting judges, practitioners to come into our space and thereby to share their experience with our students and to inspire our students. And that for me is a key point to what we're doing, which is to have a faculty and a graduate that is not isolated from the realities of practice in its broadest forms, and to integrate the best of what is available internationally, nationally, from both the professoriate, but also from the legal profession itself, from the ranks of legal practitioners, attorneys, advocates, and the judiciary, integrate the best of what we can attract into our space for the benefit of students. And I think all of that bodes for some interesting times ahead. I must perhaps end off by saying that all of this is, of course, work in progress. All of this has been born out of in a sense, in hindsight, the fortuitous marrying of a national review process combined with a strong agitation from the ground, from some people who are in this room, who assisted in pushing the faculty, not always kicking and screaming, but certainly pushing the faculty in terms of interrogating what it was doing, moving it out of its comfort zone. And we were certainly aided by, at times, sets of demands from students. Couldn't accede to all of them, but the good ones, for example, law students representing fellow students at disciplinary hearings, those are now ingrained in our system. So certainly where we're going is the product of where we've come from. And I think it's fantastic that we now have a platform. I hope, Pedro, that this will become not a once-off, but hopefully a semi-regular type of occurrence. And we look forward to reading what our students have to say. And we look forward to this generation of law graduate from Nelson Mandela University being part of addressing the original conundrum that has been posed, which is how do we decolonize the legal curriculum when the legal system itself needs work? And I'm sure that with writing like this, we'll be able to start to tackle that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dean. The colleagues who have joined us, you can take a seat at the front. If there's anyone who hasn't received a copy of the journal, please raise your hand and get yourself a copy. Yeah, to those who've joined us, welcome to our decolonial venue. This is a student venue where meetings of student formations, underground movements, SRC, everyone else who's agitating to deliver positive disruptions in the system. This is where meetings sit. So we welcome you to our space as student activists. Let me not waste any time, colleagues. Let's go to the panel. I want to invite Mobile, Apiwe, and Snoyolo to the front. We sent an invitation on memo for students to contribute from all faculties. It was not limited only to those who do law. A variety of articles were submitted and we selected 5. And then for the panel we selected 3 randomly. It was not in any particular order. And these 3 students, their articles are here. So you can read further at home on what they want to say. And if you want to contribute on the next one, we will explain those procedures later on. Okay, colleagues, tell the floor what is the argument of the articles, and I will open it up for discussion. Let's start in the middle.
Hi everyone. My name is and my paper is about Ubuntu, looking at the quality of human beings in South Africa. The paper is centered around a case which pertains to an asylum seeker who came to South Africa seeking refugee. So the issue arises when the asylum seeker wants to register marriage in terms of South African law, but then was barred from doing that. In terms of South Africa, the right to family life is linked to human dignity, and human dignity is recognized as the cornerstone of a democratic society. So, as a person who is studying law, I couldn't rationalize how a human being could have a basic human rights limited. So my paper looks at that particular case and it scrutinizes how the looks at that particular case and scrutinizes how the law actually deals with cases like that, and Section 36, which deals with the limitation of rights. Thank you.
Appeal.
Good evening, everyone. In the spirit of decolonization, I won't specify titles, I'll just say everyone. So I wrote this article, I think, primarily because of the fact that my very academic career here as a student in NMMU, I've been unable to articulate what I felt was wrong of the law. I found the law to be very isolating and alienating in a sense. So this work is a culmination of that experience as a law student. But closer to the point that I'm about to make is that last year I was doing a module called jurisprudence, which supposedly it's there to explain how the law comes to be, jurisprudence. And one thing that I realized, the starting point of engaging what supposedly constitutes South African law, the starting point is always through the lenses of European intellectuals or European authorities, which is not necessarily a bad thing because we can't close ourselves off from the rest of the world. But it is a bad thing when their views will dominate, and also if their views were there to justify the conquest of African people, and those views dominate. So not only do their views dominate, but they constitute the very grounding on which we come into grips with the idea of law. So this article is intended to precisely problematize that. I make the argument in this article that African people or the colonized are denied from experiencing the law as their own, precisely because the negation of their own ideas of what constitutes the law alienates them. Because what the law comes to be is how the law is constituted elsewhere, which does not necessarily coincide with the African conception of what the law is. I'll make an example. The law in the African context is informal, flexible, and even the idea of precedent in terms of binding previous court decisions, it's quite an alien idea because of the belief that law is not life or human experience is not static and everything ought to be questioned from time to time. So in its very nature, the law as constituted today, it's Eurocentric. And because of that Eurocentrism, our experiences with the law, by and large, as the African people, by and large, are violent. That is why, for example, as Mr. Zeleni is questioning me about time, that is why, for example, people who live in the rural areas, people who live in townships, their only experience with the law, it's a violent experience. Hardly does the law ever work in their favor. So the proposition that I make here in terms of now fixing the problem, having identified with what is the problem, in understanding what law is and how law ought to be, we must concretely locate it in the African archive. Furthermore, the centrality of African languages can never be overstated, because as Ngungi Watiyongo correctly points out that these languages are not merely an instrument of communication. They carry our cultures, they carry our histories, and also a language has the conceptual basis of how a particular people experiences a certain thing. For example, a certain flower among some people, it might be known as something which beautifies. Other people might know it as something which heals. Other people might know it as something that causes them allergies. There's no one particular conception which overrides all of them. And that's what colonial knowledge does. It pronounces itself as the alpha and omega and as the only valid conception. And that is what we are contesting. And the centrality of the African languages can never be overstated, pardon me, because they carry our knowledges, they carry our culture, they carry our histories. And also, the last point that I'm going to make is that Ubuntu, as practiced and lived by the African people, should constitute the base or the basis of understanding law in Africa. Furthermore, it should also constitute the basis on which we engage other understandings of law. As I have said earlier on, we are not going to close off ourselves from the rest of the world. So which means African conceptions of law should no longer be a footnote. Rather, the situation be the other way around. I mean, this is an uncontroversial claim. For example, if you go to China, the dominating will be Chinese. Yeah, I think they're onto me already. But I've abused the chairperson quite intensely, and I'll end there. Thank you.
Ismail?
Thank you. So if I break this thing, I apologize in advance. So I come from the Thinkers Collective, and we are a transdisciplinary group of students which is grounded predominantly in the humanities and social sciences. Our animating thought being the nature or the role of the post-colonial university. And so for us, writing this article, one of the questions which was central to us, and one of the questions which I think you should ask yourselves as you read our article is, whose voice or language does the law value? The second question is, whose body or whose experience does the law not see? And so how we contextualized these questions then was to look at, or rather was to compare colonial times and spaces with the democratic times and spaces. And with the idea of trying to understand the law, which was the key link between these two spaces and times. And so as we did this, we found a number of things, but because of time, I will only mention, say, two. Indokala that we found was that the law tends to universalize concepts and use concepts. So for example, the concept of the reasonable person, right? And what it does is it tends to erase a person's lived experiences. So even though you are seen, but you are not seen at the same time. And so your experience becomes invalid. And then the second thing that it does is it I don't know whether to say it's an arrogance on the part of the law, but it tends to translate moral and political issues into a language which the law can understand, or into a language which is acceptable into legal corridors, or yeah. And so realizing this, we came to the conclusion that the law has to be decolonized. And by decolonization, we mean that it must excuse itself from European precepts, things like certainty of the law. Because as we experience certainty, it's not really certainty, but it's more rigidity of the law. The other precept would be capitalism, which is a system which Sylvia Winter describes as a system which values productivity, right, to the extent of limiting the creative capabilities of the human. And so as the law then excuses itself from these European precepts, we demand, or we expect that it must be attentive to its adherents' lived experiences. And this would require a level of slowness within the law and a level of fluidity. And I suppose that would also disrupt order as we currently understand it. Thank you.
Sure. All right. I'll now open it up to the floor. If you look at the journal, for those who are at home, or those who couldn't get the hard copy, please tell them that this is the website, krisha.mandela.ac.za. You log in, it's on the front page. You click there and you download this journal on your cell phone. Yeah? So, 3 powerful conceptual arguments put on the table by the 3 speakers. Up here on the far left is on page 2. And you heard him. He puts on the table the current misrecognition that jurisprudence does to African people. In the middle, Mobile, page 8, a very powerful article in light of the xenophobic challenges we face, how the law misrecognizes immigrants in South African nativism. And then there was an interesting concept by the Thinkers Collective, page 17, represented by Usnoyolo here. You know that articles in academia tend to want to put points to individuals. So you produce knowledge as a group, but in order for that article to be accepted and given units, it must be registered under an individual or a pair or 3 people. Well, they said we don't want to be called people, we're a group, which was a very interesting thing to put at the table. Very interesting stuff. So, as I go to the floor for questions, I want to make 2 pleas with the floor. The first plea is a question must be a question, not a speech. Ne? Must be a question. And secondly, there are those tendencies of bringing questions from home. You know that tendency? No matter what the speakers said, there's that question you woke up with in the morning. And you told yourself that because the topic is decolonization of law, I am going to ask it anyway. Others even travel with their questions, Mr. Zin. They ask them tonight, and then if tomorrow there's a program at North Campus, they ask that. I plead with you tonight. Just ask questions based on the 3 concepts that have been presented tonight, so that they come back after your questions to sharpen their arguments and clarify them further, so that this discussion has its own authentic and novel outcome. Right? In that manner, colleagues, I'll take questions. 1, 2, 3. Only 3 questions from those concepts that were here. Okay. Let me issue a warning. There's no second round. There's no second round. Going once, twice, will be the last 2. Sure. Questions? Number 1.
Thank you so much. My name is Unobubele Snoyolo. Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to go to the concepts that you use on South Africa as space and further defining place and space and so on. If you could please elaborate for me that how do you want me to think of a court when I'm reading through your article as place, space, and in the context of inserting bodies in space to give place then a non-material feeling of cultures, of values, of behaviors, of emotions, of care. If you can just assist me with that thinking. I see you used a lot of people that talk about space invaders and who's been excluded from a space and who's there and who isn't. So if you can just help me with that, how must I feel and what must I think when I'm reading through from that starting point of space and place?
Number 2.
Okay, hi. My name is Vyoka Zekwam. My question is to Mr. Apwebizani. And you did mention that the law is Eurocentric. I just want to know, since modernization itself is also Eurocentric or is believed to be Eurocentric, how are we going to decolonize the law? I'm guessing South Africa wants to be modernized as well. So how are we going to decolonize the law while we want to be modernized as well?
Question 3.
Hi, everyone. I think my question goes to all 3 speakers, and it speaks to decolonizing or decolonization, decentering something. So it moves the focus from one thing into the other. And I think the commonality through all 3 speakers spoke to the idea of Ubuntu. So my question then becomes, how does the transition work? Because I think with a lot of decolonial work, when you decolonize something, there has to be a pause or a stop so that the old can stop and then the new can then be reproduced from a new conceptualization. So since you spoke about certainty and things like that, what kind of transition period or transition model do you envision in order for us to move towards a decolonized law? Thanks.
Sure. 4.
Apiwa. I'm curious, since you mentioned the issue of language, which is very important. I mean, some of the arguments usually that are put out is certain concepts do not exist in, for example, in indigenous languages and so on. So sometimes within the, at least I think within the questions of decolonization, that at times hinders us moving forward. Because I, for one, think, for example, the concept in itself is not just a name. It should be something that kind of gives you a direction or orientation towards thinking. Having said that, I'm curious then, in some of the things you mentioned, would you say in terms of decolonization around law, what would be would rather co-creation involve that aspect? Because you also mentioned that it shouldn't be a footnote of Africa. We should also try to see ourselves as being part of the world. So I'm curious around that question. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, last question. Yonel.
Molweni, igama lam ndinguyonela Mashalaba. My first part of the question was covered by the third person that asked the question. And the second part I wanted to know in terms of, because I didn't get like the chance to go through everything, but like in terms of the first and the third speaker, wouldn't you say that what you have submitted is already covered in our customary law? Because the customary law is seen to be a law that is fluid and is able to change over time. And if it's not covered, what would be the new aspects of that you think your proposal will bring to the forefront?
Thanks. Now, let me hand back to the panel. Whoever can go first.
Quickly, and I must just say I was hoping maybe the dean Bezon Tetelelo Prof Govindjee, because I felt like everyone was picking on me and to be asked such difficult questions during the examination period. Yeah, but quickly, my response to you, and perhaps it might be answered expected because I will respond from my own ideological standpoint, recognizing the fact that someone else might be wrong. The problem is the problem of South Africa. South Africa as a polity was born out of the political imagination of settlers. And the last paragraph does make the argument in passing that South Africa itself will have to end. And even our conception of progress, because often progress is tied to modernity, even those understandings will have to change. And just a critique on the current understanding of modernity, it's very interesting to observe that we are regarded as a constitutional democracy which is modern, but yet we have so much disjuncture between what the Constitution says and the reality lived by the people. I don't know if that's the kind of progress we envision as linked to modernity. But we'll educate each other more outside the venue if I don't cover all the, if I don't answer you substantively because of time. I've been cautioned. Comrade Mzileni says that I'm very mischievous when it comes to time. Comrade Bwanika, what happens in the transitional period? I regard that as a period, as a moment of madness. We are disrupting intellectually, but also in terms of the practicals, we are disrupting. But also, we must not fear change, because often than not, change is equated to this unguided process. I mean, decolonization on its own, it's violent, but it's violent in a liberating way. And that's the kind of transitional period that I envision. But to concede that it's a point which might also be unsatisfactory because of the fact that I might not answer it the way you might have preferred. But that's what I envision. So we must disrupt in the classroom. Yes, we must disrupt in the classroom. Moving to the question of customary law, I do make reference to customary law, but in principle, and I use quotations as an indication that I do not accept customary law as is, because it was in a way hijacked by colonialists, and it was used in service of colonial conquest. Even in fact, the idea of customary law is a contestable one. I mean, Musinoyolo did make the point of how European knowledge universalizes itself, and then it particularizes African knowledge. So that's also an argument that that's also a concept that we are contesting. But the spirit of your question, I do accept the fact that some of these issues are covered by what we would say constitutes the laws of the indigenous people. And the work that we are doing, me and everyone else that contributed, is to draw from the reservoir of the African conceptions of law, because what you might take for granted as someone who reads, but this thing is easily out there, but for someone else it might not be. Then lastly, on the question of language, I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, but I'll answer it anyway. So the idea of co-creation is a key one, and perhaps Prof. Govindjee, maybe years to come, me as Snoyolo, for example, can co-author a doctoral thesis on this particular topic as an indication that in the African conception, we don't subscribe to the liberal ontology of self, where the emphasis is on the individual. So the question of language then becomes instrumental, because the language itself, it will denote how we conceptualize society in relation to the people. So it becomes very instrumental. And also I use the concept of decolonization, in fact, in protest, noting, for example, one of the most lethal critiques against decolonization, Umamutisane, and alluding to ukuhlambulula. So I accept that point that we need to interrogate the concept, but because of time and word count, we couldn't exploit in depth. Thank you.
So the first question, was so place as we describe it in the article is. Or rather space, let me start with space. Space would describe it as people, practices, or maybe symbols which typify a geographical location, which we could call a place, right? And so what we do then, because what we're comparing apartheid spaces with the present ones, democratic ones. And so what we find is that even though there has been a transitional period, there hasn't been much change in the space, in the sense that colonial apartheid spaces were built to exclude people based on race, based on gender, based on religion and things like that. But even though to this day we could say that the spaces have been opened, or there has been a transition in from colonial spaces to apartheid ones, what has happened is the symbols which typify such spaces have not been changed. What happened was a race which was previously excluded was now included, right? And so I think you made an example, or you were asking about courts. So for instance, where you would have a white judge pronouncing on laws made by white people based on European precepts, now you would have a black judge, what's the word now? Making a judgment on using laws which supposedly are created by black people, but then the precepts of the law and the foundational values of the law remain Western. And so there has been an illusion of a change in times and spaces, but no such thing has happened. I hope and then sir at the back, because I don't think I caught your name. You asked about the transitional method to bring about decolonization. And I think I will tend to agree with Uapiwe when he talks of madness, because in honesty, I don't want to lie, because colonization and racism and all those things have been with us for more than 300 years, right? And so it is exactly what we know right now, and it's the one thing that we understand. But what we're trying to do is to move away from such exclusionary and debasing values of building society. And so it would require disruption, and it would and basically it would require us to I think we touch on it in the article towards the end, that it would require us to center experiences of people, the previously marginalized people. And then on the question of customary law, I think we touch on it quite widely on the article, and quoting Himonga, in fact, and we talk about how customary law is a conception of colonization as well, and how custom before customary law was a thing of it wasn't necessarily a law, but it was a factor which facilitated relations amongst people in a society. And so what the Constitution then does, or what customary law does under the Constitution and under colonialism, is it takes a certain nature which is characterized by rigidity. And so we have then this system of customary law which is influenced not only by colonialism but by religion and all these factors which are very European. And so I don't know. Yeah, I think that's
I don't think there was a question directed to me, but I would just like to add on the question Lawrence had on how does the transition work in terms of decolonizing law. In my opinion, the basics would be going back to what Africa was before the Europeans came here. We would have to unlearn a lot of things and find ourselves and learn what Africans are, and find a way into making law ours and not what the Europeans came with in South Africa. So yes, thank you.
Okay. Colleagues, I'll be doing crime if I don't also acknowledge the other two authors in this article. Maybe they can raise their hands. Lubisi Toriso, Nosonabise Lande. There they are. All right. So you can give the panel as well a round of applause. Thank you so much. All right, we're right on time. The time is exactly 6 o'clock, and before I call the TVC up to give closing remarks on building consciousness, writing communities, that's what he will speak on. But before I call him up, I just want to make one announcement that I don't think will come up. So I'll make the announcement, TVC speaks, and then we go to vote of thanks, and then the refreshments. The next edition will be published in 2020 first semester, right? The call for articles will come out in March, and I think it will be published around the end of May. The theme for the next one would be on gender or African feminism. That's the next one. The guest editor for that one will be Unobubele Pusa. So when that call comes out, please do take the opportunity to submit your abstract, write your articles, and make your points public on this thing. We're developing a journal, colleagues, that is going to ultimately be accredited by DHET, but obviously to do that, you must build this reputation first. So we're collecting these copies. We're also going to work with the library service so that if you want to reference one of them, they are actually available on the library. So that work, the consistency, the citations, the consistent publications, they do build that reputation for it ultimately to be accredited by DHET. That's the long-term strategy, and we're going to achieve that, though the heavens may fall. Next up, the DVC for operations, Mr. Lebogang Hashatse.
No. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think this is very encouraging. I think the dean was saying earlier on to say that this should not be the last. Sometimes it's easy to start, but it's actually difficult to see it through. But what I want to do by talking to the concept of building consciousness is just to share about the work that has historically been happening, for as long as there's subjugation, for as long as there's oppression, the work does not end, which is perhaps the reason why the Mozambicans, in the form of Frelimo, coined the phrase that a luta continua. I mean, the reason is that the struggle continues, okay, and it continues obviously in different forms. Let me just start off by talking about the concept of writing and why writing is important, and also who writes is equally an important question. Let me take you to we all know that, the struggle has to do with the occupation of spaces of people by the colonizers, and it's a long struggle that has been waged for many centuries. And when those struggles continued towards the end of the 1800s, you also had the beginning of mobilization against occupation, and then you started having occupied countries liberating or getting liberated. One of those first ones was India. I think it was in 1947. And India then, pre-independence and immediately post-independence, was led, among others, by Nehru. I'm sure you would know the name, Nehru, or if not, perhaps you should begin to start thinking about the work that he did. One of the statements he made was to then say at the time, history is almost always written by the victors and the conquerors, and gives their view. Or at any rate, the victor's vision is given prominence and holds the field. I mean, the points that have been made is exactly the same thing that I think the struggle then was about in terms of beginning to understand how colonization works. And generally speaking, this kind of, quotations, we tend to refer to it quite often anecdotally as the lion writes the history, or the hunter writes the history, or the victors write the history. But that's what Nehru was dealing with at the time as well. That wasn't unique, because on our own continent, you had people like Julius Nyerere. He was referred to as the teacher, and I think the name that he was being used, that was used for him was Mwalimu, which was, in his language, it meant the teacher. And he tried to establish a type of African socialism at the time based in rural areas, in rural communities. In other words, building communities with consciousness and teaching and writing. And he used to write in a publication called Katutura. And Katutura is one of the townships in Namibia. So that's another example about how the struggle has been waged through writing. In our instance in South Africa, right from the early century, there's been quite activism around combining struggles with writing, with journalism, with scholarship. And one prominent person in the early century was Ruth First. Ruth First was both a journalist, writing for The Guardian and Fighting Talk, and also a scholar. When she was bombed and killed in Mozambique, she was actually a director of research at the University of Eduardo Mondlane at the time. So she was a scholar, but graduated from just writing to scholarship. And then, of course, in the time when the liberation movement were banned towards the end of the 50s, going into exiles, it didn't end up there. The question is, how then do you deal with the country while you're in exile? So the idea of having mediums of communications, was something that was conceptualized and then brought into being. And the one big one in the 70s was Radio Freedom. I mean, at the time, you didn't have what we have right now. And you used to listen to Radio Freedom through medium wave. You'll listen and it'll crackle. But it was very important to begin to propagate the struggle. In fact, the January 8th statement of the ANC were often announced through Radio Freedom. So people listened, right? And it mobilized what happened towards the end of the 70s. The other important vehicle was the Chaba at the time as well. And if you come into late 70s, from 72, 74, 76, what became very popular by popular African struggle writers was a journal or a magazine called Staff Rider. So it also captured the 70s, if you like, in terms of popular writing. And this was mainly by people who were orientated towards black consciousness at the time. And then clearly in the 70s, you started having the apartheid government, instituting a lot of banning of individuals. And one of those that were banned was P.S. Naudé. Of course, we got a guard and P.S. Naudé there. So P.S. Naudé became an outcast. He was one of the first Afrikaners to live in a township at the time. And he ran a publication called Prof Veritate at the time. The idea of that was to begin to articulate a different thinking around Afrikanism in the country. Okay, so that became part of the struggle. If you then come to the 80s, you've got people such as Thomas Sankara. Or maybe even before then, you have people like Ngugi. Ngugi has been referred to. The book that we commonly know now, because he's written a lot. In fact, in the 70s as well, the other important thing as well, there was a Heinemann publication, or writers, company. It was actually a mainstream company, which then began to latch onto the idea of encouraging Africans, who a lot of them were studying, overseas, to write books. And that series was known as African Writer Series, right? So people like Chinua Achebe, they wrote a lot around that, but Ngugi was one of those. He was prolific until such time that he felt like language is a weapon that can be used against people as well, and he came with the book, Decolonizing the Mind. And after that, he started writing in his own language, stopped writing in English. But recently, he's written a book called Moving the Center. Moving the center is an important concept about how you decenter, if you like, or how you begin to think differently about where you find yourself, not in Eurocentric terms. So you have to displace Eurocentrism and begin to locate yourself as a center. That's the concept of moving. So it's a very important book in that regard. And then people such as Thomas Sankara, of course, he was a revolutionary from Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is one of those small countries, supposedly very poor, but intellectually it's an incredible country. Even with film, the medium of films, they produce exceptional films as a very small country. One of the things that he was committed to was the concept of you can't have liberation without the liberation of women. And then the other point that he made was to then say, I can hear the roar of women's silence. The point that he was making there is the voice is as equally important in the liberation struggle as the physical struggle. And then he made some other points that says that he who feeds you controls you. Now, feeding is not just a physical food thing, but it's also a mental feeding. So who he feeds you, controls you. I think it's a very important concept about what it is that you consume, in terms of knowledge. Let me conclude by saying that, we were fortunate not so long ago to have Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Now, maybe the point to make before we go there is that the struggle is equally launched as an intellectual struggle. Part of that is because the dominance, in fact, apartheid did it very well, the dominance of country becomes a dominance through ideas as well, right? And the ideas are permeated through religion, through education. You control this, you control culture, okay? So the struggle has always been to invert that. 76 in Afrikaans, talk about that. But it also says that you have a dominance from some force down to another force. So if you look at the way the world is divided, the north is where a lot of what we consume, as far as writing is concerned, come from, right? Whether directly produced there or produced here, but representing the north, right? So that's the kind of dominance. Now, even in universities as we speak right now, let me just make that point quite clear, is that you've got dominance from the north to here. But if you look at the universities, universities are in fact where a lot of knowledge is produced, right? But the South African or African, in South Africa in particular actually, and the French countries, is that a lot of those universities produce essentially what is produced by the Western, right? So you've got a replication of the north into the south, right? And South African universities also equally doing that. So the struggle becomes one that then says, how do you begin to produce in the south to free yourself from the north and begin to recenter yourself and begin to direct what requires to be worked? So what Prof. Ventura is saying is now beginning to articulate. In fact, there's a whole struggle around beginning to make South-South, unite and begin have South-South beginning to do their own thing. But he's now saying, that the epistemologies of the South and the pedagogies of and methodologies that they call for enable or should enable universities to give a positive response to the challenges that we're now describing. So he's now beginning to articulate that you have to begin to produce knowledge in your own terms, right? That begins to challenge the North. Perhaps I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks, Pedro.
Karen? Thank you so much, TVC.
Good evening, everyone. The Online Perspectives Journal has come about in 2018 after a collaborative initiative by the Office of the Dean of Students and the, let me read this, I can't say crochet, I know it's crochet, but it's Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation. And this was to produce research and scholarship within the student community, and tonight there's testament of that in the form of this journal. And I want to congratulate each and everyone for their contribution towards the journal. So on behalf of the Dean of Students, Mr. Lutando Jack, and the Chair of Crochet, Professor Andre Kiet, allow me to thank the following individuals. Firstly, to the Faculty of Law for collaborating on this issue, Decolonization of Law, to the Executive Dean of Law, Professor Avinash Govindjee. Thank you for your contribution in terms of providing leadership, wisdom, support for this journal. We are grateful for your support. If you had listened to Professor Avinash, you can only say that the Faculty of Law is heading into the right direction, and really we have a visionary leader in that space, and we thank you for that. As well as a thank you to your Deputy Dean, Dr. Lynn Biggs, for her guidance and administrative support. Then thanks goes out to Professor Cheryl Foxcroft and all the staff in the Center for Teaching, Learning and Media. A special thanks to Linda Mostert and Claire Madeleine. And then a special thank you goes out to the hardworking team, this is the words of Pedro, hardworking team of Department of Student Governance and Development, under the directorship of Dr. Bernard Zabake, as well as the administrative support of Sadie Prinsloo. Am I allowed to mention myself? Asanda Penkese and Simamkele Sam, and also the ladies of Crochet. Thank you to you, Direnique, Hoshay, and Cledia Hudsenberg for your energy and support. And it's mentioned that to these ladies that no matter how short the deadlines was, they were always willing to roll up their sleeves. Thank you for that. Thank you tonight for those who contributed to the program. The very interesting remarks from Mr. Hashatse, you will agree with me. Thank you very much. As well as to the panel, when they asked for questions and I heard the questions, I thought, oh my gosh, it's higher grade questions. But you dealt very well with those questions. They say to do research is almost like a military operation. It takes discipline, it takes foresight, research, strategy, and if it's done right, it results in victory. And with those words, I want to thank the editorial team under the leadership of Mr. Pedro Zeleni and all the authors who contributed to the special edition for the resilience and commitment in creating a very insightful online perspective journal and for paving the way for future student research output. And I think we need to give these authors and the online edition a very nice round of applause. MC, thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I think the event is adjourned. You may enjoy the refreshments and safe journey home. Thank you so much.